Good evening. Uh, Please take a seat. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. My name is Kim Sawyer, and I represent the Pulitzer Center. We are a journalism organization based in Washington, D.C., and we support international reporting projects around the globe. Tonight, you will hear about the nuclear threat, but we also cover other critical issues, ranging from climate change to refugees, public health, and more. Part of our mission is to expand the reach of our journalism. We send our grantees out into the community and onto college campuses where they have the opportunity to speak about their work and meet with students. We also provide grants, mentoring, and editorial support to students from our partner universities to do their own reporting. I hope you all will go to our website and subscribe to the newsletter so you can learn more about the Pulitzer Center. I'd like to thank Cecil McCarthy, our moderator and director of the journalism program at Hunter, Harold Holzer, the director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, and Siobhan Healy, also from the Roosevelt House, for hosting us here. I'd also like to recognize Pulitzer Center board members who are with us tonight, Dick Moore and his wife, Barbara. A warm welcome to the Pulitzer Center's student fellows, past and present, who are here as well. Our 2018 Hunter College Student Fellow has just been selected. Her name is Katia Goba, and I don't think she's here yet. If she is, I've never met you, stand up. But anyway, we want to congratulate Katia, and she'll be at the reception, so I hope you all have a chance to meet her then. I'm honored to be in this hall and in this building, once home to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Given that the title of tonight's program is The Return of Cold War Nuclear Fears, I cannot help but be reminded of the words from FDR's first inaugural address made famous 85 years ago, almost to the day. So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. He went on to add, only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. We now live at a time of unease when the nuclear threat seems close at hand and school shootings make frequent headlines. The Washington Post reports that since Columbine, 187,000 students have been exposed to gun violence in their schools. But the many young people who took part in the March for Our Lives on Saturday in New York and Washington and around the world, in Parkland, London, Tokyo, and Hamburg, provided models, not of fear, but of courage, passion, and activism. Tonight, you will hear talk of dark realities, and as we face them, may we all take inspiration from the youth who came out to protest this weekend.
Thank you, Kim. And on behalf of Hunter College and the journalism program, I'd like to thank you and the Pulitzer Center for sponsoring this event and the Campus Consortium Fellowship that gives our students like Katia Goba and Amy Brusso the incredible opportunity to pursue a story that they're passionate about overseas. We're very grateful to you and your staff and your donors for this opportunity for our students. I'm also very pleased to introduce our speakers for tonight. First up, we'll have Rachel Oswald, who is a reporter covering the intersection of Capitol Hill and foreign affairs for Congressional Quarterly. Her beat includes congressional oversight of the State Department, the refugee crisis, the Iran nuclear deal, and her specialty, nuclear arms control. She just told me in the green room that she's been covering nuclear arms for 10 years now. Before Congressional Quarterly, she spent 5 years at the National Journal covering nuclear weapons issues. And this young reporter has already traveled the world on her beat. She's been to Japan, Austria, Russia, Kazakhstan, the Dominican Republic, and South Korea just this past February. She earned her BA at George Washington University with a degree in Middle Eastern Studies. Tom Hunley joined the Pulitzer Center as a senior editor after 36 years as a journalist, 20 of those as a foreign correspondent and bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune in Jerusalem, Warsaw, Rome, and London. He is also well-traveled and has reported from more than 60 countries. He's covered 3 wars in the Persian Gulf, the breakup of the Balkans, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Iran's post-revolutionary theocracy, as well as Eastern Europe's transition from communism to democracy. He graduated from Georgetown University and the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in international relations. Well, our timing for tonight's topic certainly couldn't be better, and I don't think we could be in better hands to learn more about the growing threat of the nuclear arms race in Asia and what that would mean. Just yesterday, we learned that Kim Jong-un visited Beijing in a not-so-secret visit, and that a North Korean reactor is coming online after years of construction. Now, the significance of that is that reactors don't only produce electricity. They also produce plutonium, which is one of the main fuels used in nuclear weapons. So the stakes are growing around North Korea's upcoming talks with South Korea and possibly the Trump administration. If those fail or come up short, experts say it could be quite destabilizing. And while all this is happening, South Korea is seriously considering its own nuclear weapons program. In fact, according to the British newspaper, The Independent, 60% of South Koreans are now in favor of building their own nuclear weapons arsenal. And if they do it, so could Japan and Taiwan, and then you have an all-out nuclear arms race in Asia. And on that cheery note, let's get to our reporters. Both Rachel and Tom have about a 10-minute presentation to share with you. After that, I'll be asking them a few questions, and then we're going to leave 15 to 20 minutes for questions from you, the audience. So please think about what you would like to know and what you'd like to ask them. So with no further ado, let me introduce you to Rachel Oswald.
All right, well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I pursued this grant from the Pulitzer Center to report on what's happening in South Korea because I felt like what was happening was happening beneath the radar. And one of the things I'm interested in as a journalist is the problems we don't see coming, the signs that we're not looking for, the unintended consequences of our policies. And I think South Korea fits into that nexus. So I traveled to South Korea, to Seoul, for 2 weeks, coinciding with the Olympics in February and in March. And I had a question in my mind. The big question is what is the likelihood of South Korea to get a nuclear weapon? And this is what I found. That I think the answer is more probable than not that the country will pursue a nuclear weapon let's say next 10 to 20 years, but only if 2 things happen, and those 2 things both need to happen. The first thing is that the North Korean nuclear crisis needs to get worse. Now, President Donald Trump is very excited about the prospects for denuclearization talks with Kim Jong-un, but basically every person besides President Donald Trump and his select cabinet advisors thinks that Kim Jong-un is not prepared to give up his nuclear arsenal. He has worked too hard, pushed too hard, to just give up this thing now. It's in the North Korean constitution. They talk about it all the time in their state propaganda, that they're not giving up their nuclear weapons. And most people think we should take them at their word, and that if denuclearization were to happen, it would be the work of a generation, not of a few years. So if North Korea has a nuclear weapon that can hit the United States, the expectation is that it will become much more aggressive in its foreign policy. It may try to coerce South Korea to do things it doesn't want to do. It may try to weaken the bond between South Korea and the United States and inject fear and uncertainty into the alliance. So I think number 1 is going to happen. Do I think number 2 is going to happen? I'm less certain if number 2 is going to happen. There have been some troubling signs recently from the Trump administration that suggest that they are not aware of what is happening in South Korea. Right now, conservatives in South Korea are saying that they want 2 things to happen. They'd prefer the first thing to happen, which is the redeployment of short-range U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, which we had in the peninsula for decades but withdrew in 1991 at the end of the Cold War. But if they can't get number one, they're saying we'll go for number two, and number two is the development of an independent nuclear arsenal that would most likely make use of their existing expertise in atomic energy, which is considerable. And I've included a quote here from the former National Security Advisor of the previous president, President Pak. I thought that was a very interesting quote, kind of about this emotional state that they're in, which I'm going to also talk about in my presentation. Emotions are very important for understanding this issue at the moment. Why should we be concerned about South Korea getting a nuclear weapon? They've already learned a couple of things about how to get a nuclear weapon. This was this didn't get a lot of attention when it happened in the 1970s, but under their former dictator, they were making headway. But when the United States found out about these secret weapons experiments, we pressed upon them. We used a combination of carrots and sticks to get them to shut down the program, and they did. So we've already once successfully talked South Korea out of a nuclear weapons arsenal. We could possibly do that again if they pursue it. But South Korean scientists we didn't know it at the time, but they were kind of conducting these little experiments, nothing too worrisome, but still illegal, and they only disclosed those to the international community in 2000. So we thought the weapons program had ended in the late 1970s, but these experiments were going on and off for a few decades, and we didn't know about them. So there's a lot of independent thinking going on in South Korea, and I think there's a tendency in the United States and Washington to think South Korea isn't something that we need to be concerned about because they're such a reliable partner. They're such a reliable junior little brother to the United States. So we don't need to think about them the way we have to obsess about Russia and North Korea and Iran. But South Korea is a sovereign nation with its own security concerns, and they are not always the same as the United States. The United States provides South Korea's security. South Korea has one of the biggest militaries in the world, but so much of their security decision-making is done by the United States. Somebody told me, actually multiple people told me, this is a sovereignty issue for us. We have outsourced our defense decision-making to the United States, and that had been a decision they were comfortable making for a long time, but now the security crisis is a lot worse because not only is North Korea more dangerous, but you have China coming up. And if there are concerns about whether they can trust the United States, they are no longer so certain if they're going to be comfortable outsourcing so many decisions that we in the United States could never imagine doing. I mean, could you imagine us telling the United Kingdom, you will make decisions for us. You will be in charge of when our soldiers go to fight, and you will be in charge of when our planes take to the skies. South Korea historically is a unique nation in that they have agreed to the very unique alliance that they have with the United States. They are acting ahistorically. The question is will they continue to act ahistorically? So, a thing to remember here, and I frequently find myself wanting to say this to some of the non-proliferation experts that I frequently interview in Washington, is this conversation isn't about military advantage. If it were, they would win the argument. Having tactical nuclear weapons or even a nuclear arsenal of their own, it's not at all convincing that would improve South Korea's security. But just as the United Kingdom and France in the 1950s decided that they wanted their own nuclear weapons for reasons of emotion and national pride and fear and doubt, that is the decision that South Korea is approaching. So I talked a little bit about what would happen if they begin to doubt the U.S. commitment to their national security. Some of these quotes, I think, were pretty illustrative, and President Donald Trump said this quote at the bottom after I returned from South Korea, but the two quotes from Senator Lindsey Graham, a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, those were constantly brought up to me when I was in Seoul. People were like, why would he say this? Does he know how offensive and hurtful and counterproductive this is to say this to us? And I mean, I've interviewed Senator Graham multiple times, and as a reporter, I love interviewing him. He will say anything. He will give you the quote that makes your story. He's very frank. He just speaks from the heart, and And it's alarming to South Koreans to see what he's thinking about the issue. And I really liked this quote on the right from a polling specialist I interviewed, and I think it goes to the kind of the heart of the issue. And I'm not going to extrapolate this to apply to all South Koreans, but I do think there are many South Koreans that this quote does apply to. They do not like being taken for granted. Some things to keep in mind about the political dynamics of the country. South Korea traditionally is a conservative country. For most of their existence, since the end of the Korean War, they have had conservative governments. Currently, the conservatives are in disarray. The past president, President Park Geun-hye, was impeached, and the predecessor to her, also a conservative, President Lee Moo-bak, is he in jail right now for corruption, or is he going to jail? I think he might be in jail. But basically, the conservatives have a bad track record on corruption. But that doesn't necessarily apply to national security. So the South Korean public are sick and tired of the corruption. But when it comes to defense issues, they tend to vote in conservatives, particularly when the North Korea crisis is getting worse. So the current government is run by one of the biggest liberal leaders that South Korea has ever had, President Moon Jae-in, and he is making a big gambit in his outreach to Kim Jong-un right now. But if that outreach doesn't produce results, and this outreach could extend over a year or two. Traditionally, North Korea is very adept at spinning out these aid for denuclearization talks. But if there's no results and the talks break down and then North Korea returns to its provocations, it's reasonable to think that the South Korean public would vote back in a conservative government, particularly if the conservatives can get their act together in the next 4 to 5 years. I think the next presidential elections are in 2022. And that's kind of the time horizon that I'm looking at for my reporting, is that the United States has this window of time before the next presidential election in South Korea to really pay attention to what's happening in South Korea, to listen and not kind of shrug off the way they did under President Obama the concerns that South Korean hawks are raising, and really do some massaging of the alliance, maybe give them some things they've been asking for that fall short of the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons. I'd be happy to talk about those more during the Q&A, and I'm at time.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to try to cram a 15-minute talk into 11 minutes. I'd like to talk a little about a very dangerous nuclear weapons situation that nobody talks much about, India and Pakistan. Between them, they have about 200 to 230 warheads. India and Pakistan, as you know, do not get along. The 1947 partition on the eve of independence divided what was then the British Raj into mainly Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. They have officially been to war against each other 3 times since 1947. There's been one unofficial war, and they've been on the brink many times since. During the unofficial war, the 1999 Kargil War, things nearly got out of hand, and we probably came closer than the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis to an actual nuclear war. India claims it's not really engaged in an arm race, or that if it is, its opponent is not Pakistan, it's China, a nuclear-armed superpower and economic rival with which it shares a disputed border. With both India and Pakistan armed to the teeth, it's easy to exaggerate the fears and much harder to pinpoint where the real dangers lie. For the United States, the nightmare scenario is that some of Pakistan's warheads or its fissile material falls into the hands of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, or worse, the whole country falls into the hands of the Taliban. To outsiders, Pakistan appears to be permanently teetering on the brink of collapse. The fact that large swaths of the country are literally beyond the control of the central government is not reassuring. But a weak state does not necessarily mean a weak society, and powerful internal dynamics based largely on kinship and tribe make it highly unlikely, in my opinion, that Pakistan would ever fall under the control of an outfit like the Taliban. During the country's intermittent bouts of democracy, its civilian leaders have been consistently incompetent and corrupt. And even in the worst of times, the military has maintained a high standard of professionalism, and there is nothing that matters more to the Pakistani military than keeping the nuclear arsenal, its crown jewels, out of the hands of India, the United States, and homegrown terrorists. In terms of numbers and destructive capacity, the arms buildup in South Asia does not come close to what was going on during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union built enough bombs to destroy the planet many times over. India and Pakistan have enough to destroy it once, maybe twice. But in many ways, the arms race in South Asia is more dangerous. The United States and the Soviet Union were rival superpowers jockeying for influence and advantage on the global stage. But they were also two countries that had never gone to war with each other, that had vast physical and psychological separation between them, and that generally steered clear of direct provocations and eventually had mechanisms in place, like the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow, to make sure that little misunderstandings didn't grow into monstrous miscalculations. By contrast, the India-Pakistan rivalry comes with all the venom and vindictiveness of a messy divorce, which of course it is. Pakistan has lost all of its wars with India. It has a very large army, but it's still only half the size of India's. India's military budget is more than 7 times larger than Pakistan's. Pakistan's generals are well aware that in any all-out conventional confrontation with India, they're toast. The guiding ideology of Pakistan's army, from the generals down to their drivers, is that India represents a permanent existential threat, and that's why Pakistan feels a need to cling to its nukes. This asymmetry increases the danger of the nuclear arms race. It feeds India's hubris and Pakistan's sense of failure. Here are two countries headed in opposite directions. India's $2.2 trillion economy is 8 times the size of Pakistan's. India is in the forefront of the digital revolution, while Pakistan struggles to provide electricity to its population. India, as the world's largest democracy, is on the cusp of becoming a global power, and Pakistan, with its on and off military dictatorships, looks like a failed state. More significant than these statistics, though, is the mindset behind them. India is brimming with confidence, and Pakistan is hobbled by fear, paranoia, and a deep sense of inferiority. India's major cities, New Delhi, Mumbai, are modernizing global metropolises. Checking into the Marriott in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, it's like checking into a maximum security prison. High walls topped with razor wire, armed guards and watchtowers. It's been blown up once. I was back there last month to report on an alarming new development in the South Asia nuclear arms race, which we could call the nuclearization of the Indian Ocean. In August 2016, India deployed its first nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarine, that boat there. A second, even more advanced Indian nuclear submarine began sea trials last November, and 4 more boats are scheduled to join the fleet by 2025. That will give India a complete nuclear triad, which means India will have the ability to deliver a nuclear strike by land-based missiles, by warplanes, and by submarines. Pakistan does not have the capacity to build nuclear-powered submarines, but it will soon place nuclear-tipped cruise missiles on some of its 5 diesel-electric submarines. It has also reached a deal with China to buy 8 more diesel-electric submarines that can be equipped with nuclear weapons. Even more disturbing, Pakistan military authorities say they are considering the possibility of putting nuclear-tipped cruise missiles on surface vessels. This is a disaster that should be setting off alarms around the world, but the situation is going almost unnoticed. The disaster is that putting nukes at sea significantly weakens the chain of command and control over the weapons, which means the risk of an accidental exchange between India and Pakistan will increase significantly. Up until now, both Pakistan and India have implemented rigorous checks to keep their weapons safe and eliminate the possibility of inadvertent or rogue launches. Both countries have kept their warheads and delivery systems demated. That is, the nuclear warhead is stored far away from the missile that would deliver it. But at sea, and especially when you go beneath the sea, this is pretty much impossible. The warheads and the missiles have already been assembled and stored in the same place, and individual submarine captains have significant freedom to decide whether to launch. In submarine warfare, the glaring weak link in the chain of command has always been communication between the sub beneath the sea and the central command. It's hard to believe in this era of internet and Wi-Fi, but normal radio waves cannot penetrate beneath the ocean. To communicate with a submerged submarine, you need something called very low frequency, VLF, or extremely low frequency, ELF, radio transmissions. These frequencies cannot carry voice communications, only coded messages, or very, very slowly text messages. And they only work at depths of less than 20 meters. These communications are also strictly one way. Subs can hear what the ground commanders are telling them, but they can't reply or ask questions. A few years ago, there was a terrific thriller with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman called Crimson Tide. I don't know if anyone remembers it, but it gave a pretty accurate picture of how things can go wrong quickly in the extreme isolation of a nuclear submarine cut off from centralized command. It's not hard to imagine a Crimson Tide scenario in which an Indian submarine commander gets a signal that his country is under attack. He then receives an incomplete or unclear order to launch. What does he do? Or here's another scenario. India knocks out Pakistan's only VLF transmitter in Karachi, and these are great big sitting ducks. You can't hide them. The beleaguered commander of one of Pakistan's diesel-electric submarines are lost in the fog of war, unable to communicate with the National Command Authority, and under attack by one of India's highly capable anti-submarine hunters, launches a cruise missile. Is it armed with a conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead? Do Indian authorities wait until it hits a major population center to find out, or do they order an immediate retaliatory attack? So a little bit more here. Over the years, India's military has been really frustrated by Pakistan's tactic of allowing terror groups to fight a low-grade proxy war against India. Pakistan figures it can use this tactic to hurt India without fear of retaliation because India would be afraid of provoking a nuclear response. The 2008 Mumbai attack was the most egregious example of this. That terrorism is the classic underdog's tactic. Pakistan is clearly the underdog in any non-nuclear matchup with India, but it is certainly the world's first nuclear-armed underdog to successfully apply the tactic against a nuclear rival. India, infuriated by what it sees as a kind of blackmail, is looking for strategies in which it could apply its superior conventional force to punish Pakistan without provoking a nuclear response. Pakistan, meanwhile, has tweaked its nuclear doctrine from credible minimum deterrence to something it now calls full-spectrum deterrence, which apparently countenances the use of low-yield tactical battlefield nuclear weapons on its own territory in the event the Indians cross the border. In other words, Pakistan is willing to nuke itself, another unsettling first in the annals of nuclear deterrence. During the Cold War, the dynamic that drove the US-Soviet arms race was MAD, mutual assured destruction, which saw both sides accumulate vast arsenals with tens of thousands of warheads. The logic was that each side possessed such overwhelming destructive power that neither side would ever dare use it. Both sides understood that a nuclear war was unwinnable and therefore unthinkable. A reverse dynamic propels the India-Pakistan rivalry. As India explores ways to use its overwhelming conventional military advantage, a nervous Pakistan is forced to keep lowering the threshold for nuclear retaliation. Experts who have modeled an India-Pakistan nuclear exchange say that once the first nuke is launched, it would be nearly impossible for either side to de-escalate. That means each side would likely attempt to unleash its entire arsenal of 100 or more nuclear weapons on the other side's population centers. The ensuing firestorm would release a cloud of radioactive ash that would darken skies, cool temperatures, disrupt agriculture around the globe for a decade or more. Millions would die. Millions more would be faced with displacement and starvation as we enter what scientists describe as nuclear winter. I'm over my allotted time here, so I'll end on that cheery note. Thank you.
All right, now that we're totally depressed, Rachel, let's start with you. What do you think about Kim Jong-un's visit to Beijing? Was he going there to get Xi's blessing for his upcoming talks with South Korea and the Trump administration? What does it mean for his nuclear weapons program and for future negotiations?
So I don't think that Kim Jong-un thinks he needs Xi's blessing. Nothing he's done in his since he took power from his father after his father's death in 2011 has suggested he feels he needs to ask anybody for permission. But some smart people who I read, what they're saying is that this is probably to let China know what's happening. Kim Jong-un spent the first years of his rule trying to consolidate power and rapidly push forward the nuclear program. And I think now we're into phase 2. It's like he feels like he's done those two things and now he's kind of ready to come out. And so he's going to be engaging a little bit more with China. We don't yet know how. Under Kim Jong-il, North Korea was more of a client state than it currently is. Largely as a result of Kim Jong-un's nuclear progress, China has reduced the economic support it provides to North Korea under strong urging by the United States and President Trump through sanctions imposition. So North Korea is in a client state, but it also, I think the phrase they use is it's the teeth. It's China's teeth or something like that. Having North Korea there is a really important buffer for China. They don't want to see North Korea go away, and they don't want to see a government in place in North Korea that would be allied with the United States, because that would allow borders right on China, soldiers right on China's doorstep. So I think this is about letting China know what's happening. I think the Chinese are a little uncertain about what's going on at the moment because they themselves haven't had much talks with the North Koreans, and they don't want to feel out of the loop. Traditionally, China was the convener of what they were called the six-party nuclear talks, and they happened in Beijing, and China was the host. But what South Korean President Moon Jae-in has done, he's kind of taken Kim Jong-un actually made the first outreach with his New Year's Day speech this year, and President Moon accepted that, and they extended it to the United States. So it's kind of a trilateral thing happening right now, and I don't think
at the Olympics.
At the Olympics, yep. So you're having a little bit of trilateral things, and I think this is partly China wanting to make sure it's still part of the conversation with what that trip was.
And Tom, what do you think is different? There's a lot different between the Obama administration and Trump administration, but what do you think is different on this nuclear arms proliferation policies? How would you describe the differences between their approaches?
Well, in South Asia, I think the approach has been similar. They're not paying attention, neither of them. If you try to look for a U.S. policy, the U.S. last summer did a large joint exercise, naval exercise in the Indian Ocean with with India and Japan. And this was aimed at sending a message to China. And I think all it did was scare the hell out of Pakistan and push Pakistan and China closer together. But there doesn't seem to be a really coherent U.S. policy.
And Rachel, you've been told by some of your sources that the potential for a nuclear misunderstanding during a moment of crisis has not been this high since 1962's Cuban Missile Crisis. Is that just hyperbole, or how do you view the threat?
If it is hyperbole, it's even worse now. The Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists in the last month or so, they have this famous clock, and the hands get closer to midnight depending on the state of the likelihood of a nuclear doomsday. And it's the closest to midnight it's been since 1953. So according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, it's even worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was like a state of heightened tension over a period of months. And we're looking at a state of heightened tension over a period of years. And even though there were more nuclear weapons during the Cold War than there are today, as Tom was saying, the power centers are everywhere. It's not just the U.S. and the USSR, and to a lesser extent France and the United Kingdom, which could be trusted to follow the United States lead. This is so many countries now have nuclear weapons, and they're not talking to each other. They're not communicating, and I think that is why people are very concerned about misunderstandings escalating. A few weeks ago, before we began this new exciting round of diplomacy with North Korea, the fear in Washington was that the United States would, under Trump, order a preventative strike on North Korea, a bloody nose strike, with the idea being that if North Korea tested another ICBM, we would launch a limited conventional military attack on maybe one or two of their military sites to teach them a lesson. And they would take that lesson and they would learn it and they would realize we can't do this anymore. And everybody except a couple of people in the White House thought this was stupid. And they thought that's not how North Korea will respond. You have no idea how they'll respond. But everything in their history says that they need to take it up a notch, because if they're seen to back down, then in the North Koreans' security view, then they are vulnerable to invasion. So that could be an unintended miscalculation. It's not clear that President Trump and his officials say that they weren't considering that, but not many people believe that, and not many people in South Korea believe that they weren't considering it. The recent administration moves President Trump has made in his cabinet, where he surrounded himself with some of the most hawkish, aggressive voices.
And now John Bolton.
Exactly. Some of the most aggressive, hawkish voices in foreign policy. This is the most hawkish cabinet, they're now calling it a war cabinet, that we have had in modern times. And it's not clear what they would do in a tense situation.
Mm-hmm. So what are you hearing from the experts that you're talking to, both of you, about how the U.S. should be responding? I know you're saying raise awareness. What else should the U.S. be doing, the Trump administration be doing?
Well, a few months ago, the Trump administration sort of unilaterally cut aid to Pakistan. Pakistan is a difficult, somewhat unreliable ally, but just doing that. So I mean, I think he did it in a tweet. That tends to unhinge the Pakistanis, which is not a helpful thing. The U.S. also made what appears to have been I think the end of the Bush administration made a bad deal with India, allowing them into the nuclear suppliers group without enough restrictions, which allows India to buy or import plutonium for their civilian use, which enables them to produce their own plutonium for their weapons program without any inspection. These sorts of loopholes could be tightened up, and these kinds of threats should be avoided.
What are you hearing, Rachel?
I think I would just echo what Tom said. Just a lot of, for one thing, there's the it feels like Washington isn't capable of doing many different things at the moment. Right now, concerns about Russia are taking up a lot of airspace, and I'm not saying that that's not an important issue, but we, in addition to concerns about Russia's aggressive activities, there's questions about whether President Trump is going to withdraw the United States from the Iran deal. Doing that at the exact same moment when we may be entering into nuclear talks with Kim Jong-un. I'm not quite sure what message President Trump thinks that would send to Kim Jong-un, that we would just tear up a nuclear agreement even though Iran hasn't violated it. And then the India-Pakistan issue. And then my South Korea issue. There's just a lot of things happening right now, and it's happening at a time of a lot of disorganization in the U.S. There's been so much changeover among staff at the White House. So I hate being this depressing, but it could not be happening at a worse time. It could not be happening at a worse time, that the world is becoming more turbulent and uncertain, while we in the United States, and we've traditionally since World War II had this kind of policeman role, and we're not perfect, but we've kind of overseen the peace. And there's just so much chaos coming from Washington right now that it's really hard for us to be thinking strategically. There are a lot of bright minds in the U.S. government, there really are, but if you don't have good leadership coming from the very top, and if it's not consistent and coherent, it's really hard for the men and women who do our national security to be good at their jobs.
Let's hear from the audience. Does anyone have a question? We have a student here with a mic.
Thank you very much. Moderator asked a very direct question, and that is, what would you do if you were running the U.S. government? You both defined the issues very clearly, but unless I missed it, I didn't hear specific recommendations other than there should be better leadership, there should be more coherent strategy, et cetera, which we all agree with. But here you both spent a lot of years studying the issues, talking with people who are very smart. What would you do if you were, in charge of U.S. security and the president listened to you?
Thanks for the follow-up question.
That was a fair follow-up. In the article that I have coming out in Congressional Quarterly, April 9th, I spent a little bit of time at the end about what the U.S. could do in these intervening years with South Korea, and I'll address that because I was recently reporting on it. I think the United States could provide more reassurance by adapting the extended nuclear guarantees we provide to South Korea to make them a little bit more like what we have with NATO. NATO gets to have a little bit more information about U.S. nuclear weapons posture than South Korea currently does. And this is a thing about South Koreans. They're constantly talking about, well, NATO gets to have this and Japan gets to have this, so why can't we have this? And so there are some things we could do on that probably would be manageable. We could increase the number of deployments of heavy bombers, which carry nuclear weapons, and ballistic missile submarines, which carry nuclear weapons, in the Asia Pacific. One of the experts I used for my piece recommended having 75% of the time a deployment of a heavy bomber in the region and a ballistic missile submarine, so South Korea is feeling a little bit more reassured. So that's an example on that, and I would just say, just in general, just be paying. There's no silver bullet. There's no really easy thing to do with these crises. These crises have existed as long as they have because they're really hard to resolve. India, Pakistan, North Korea, there's no easy answer. It's about managing them. And management is really frustrating and time-consuming, but that's where we are right now. We're trying to manage problems so they don't become crises.
Another question from the audience?
Rachel, what are the probability that Trump and Kim Jong-un actually will meet someday in the near future? We hear a lot of talk about this, how this caught Trump's people off guard. What do you think will happen?
They haven't set a date yet. They haven't set a time. President Trump's spokespeople are talking about the potential for a summit, the potential being the key word. They are still leaving themselves some room to just back off of this meeting. North Korea has twice now told President Trump that they want to meet, but that has been through intermediaries. The first one was through the South Korean security advisor, and now through Kim's meeting with Xi. But they haven't used what's called the New York channel, at least to my knowledge. They haven't used the New York channel, which is the United Nations, where North Korea does have representation, and that has traditionally been the way that the U.S. directly talks with North Korea. So we haven't had a formal invitation. I think a lot of things could still go wrong, and there could be no meeting. Many people in the United States didn't want this meeting to happen right now because there's a feeling like we're not ready. We don't have our negotiating strategy ready. Wendy Sherman, a former State Department official who was involved in both the Clinton administration nuclear talks with North Korea, and then she led the Iran nuclear deal talks with under President Obama. When they began the Iran talks, she said they had a 100-page technical document that was their negotiating position on the Iran talks. Now they knew they were going to get it, but that was just technical issues that they wanted resolved. With North Korea, we don't have that in large part because they're just a mystery. They have kicked out UN nuclear inspectors many years ago in the 90s, or maybe the aughts. In the aughts, they kicked them out. And in that time, since they've done all of this nuclear advancement, we can use our satellites to draw to get an understanding of what's happening, but we really don't know what's happening, so we don't know what to negotiate from other than to just have a blanket request to please stop testing nuclear weapons and please stop producing nuclear weapons. But I think a first step in an ideal world would be North Korea allows UN inspectors back into the country, and they allow the UN to document how many fissile material sites and missile sites and warhead sites they have. So then that could be the beginnings of a potential talks. Yeah.
We have a question right here. The student right here. Right here.
So I suppose this question is kind of addressed to both of you. What do you see China doing in the event of a nuclear conflict, either between North Korea and the United States or between India and Pakistan?
Tom, you want to take that?
I think you could answer this better than me. I don't know what China would do, but remember the words of Chairman Mao that nuclear weapons were a paper tiger. They were a useless weapon because they were a weapon that you could never use. And I think they may still believe that.
Yeah. China officially has a no first use policy, which says they will not be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. But to your question about what they would do if something happened, so China is a protector to a certain extent of Pakistan. China provides Pakistan with considerable economic support, including nuclear energy support. A lot of Pakistan's nuclear energy infrastructure is being built by China with no safeguards, and China allows this, knowing that they could be diverting that to their weapons program, because China, like it sees North Korea, sees Pakistan as an important buffer state to India. China, doesn't want India to become so powerful that it could challenge its dominance in the region. So there's a likelihood that China would look askance at anything that would remove Pakistan as a buffer for it. As far as North Korea is concerned, I think it would depend on exactly what happened. China doesn't like Kim Jong-un, but China doesn't want North Korea to become a normal state. I guess a normal state in that it would have normal diplomatic relations with South Korea and the United States. China likes having North Korea as a buffer to South Korea and the United States.
And it certainly doesn't want a unified Korea.
That's right, because that would mean U.S. troops on China's doorstep.
We have a question right here.
brought up an interesting idea before about some sort of NATO-esque situation that I think South Korea would prefer. However, how would the other regional players take to something like that? So India, Pakistan, China, and more importantly, Russia, who is already freaking out at the idea of an expansive NATO, now having a Pacific version of this.
Yeah, so it's so interesting, and that's a good question. The rest of the world doesn't think like us, and we need to do a lot better job about putting ourselves in the rest of the world's footsteps when we're making our policies in Washington. China, I don't think they're right about this, but China, rather than be, historically, China has been less concerned about North Korea than about a trilateral alliance forming with South Korea and Japan and the United States, because South Korea and Japan have some of the region's biggest militaries and biggest economies, and if they are fully unified, they could do a lot to contain China. China really doesn't want that to happen. And if India were to become part of this, not to mention Australia, like that is something China is very focused on and very concerned about. What would Russia do? Russia wouldn't welcome it. Russia traditionally has been consumed with issues with Europe, but it has gone to war with Japan before. They do see China as some kind of frenemy, sometimes to be strategically aligned with, but more often than not to be warily watchful about. I just think it gets very complicated very fast when you begin thinking about the alliance dynamics.
The second round.
How do you feel about the potential cuts to diplomacy that the Trump administration is, deliberating making or has made?
The budget cuts? Yeah. So I've covered that. Everybody loves to quote Defense Secretary Mattis, but it's because he gave a good quote. If you cut money for diplomacy, then you need to give him more money for bullets. Diplomacy is more cost efficient than having a military intervention, and it can be frustrating, it can be time consuming. It's managing issues so they don't become crises. I think what we did see last week with the much very overdue late budget, that spending deal that Congress released, was that they essentially completely ignored President Trump in his pursuit of 30% cuts to the State Department and diplomacy. And they're mostly keeping funding for the State Department and foreign aid at levels that they were under Obama. And they've even increased funding in a number of foreign aid programs. So, so what Congress has said is they've said that's a bad idea, and we're going to ignore you on that.
And then in the third row, we have time for a couple more.
Do either of you think it's possible to eliminate nuclear weapons worldwide? And how can you do that? Do you need to pull survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to tell them what happened and how dangerous it is, or I don't know.
How will that happen? How could it happen?
The Obama administration at the beginning really took this seriously, and there had been tremendous momentum before that. The U.S. and the former Soviet Union went from about 50,000 warheads down to what is it now? About 12 between them, 5 in the U.S., 7 in Russia. And at the beginning of the Obama administration, there was some momentum to build on that, and it has been lost. The Trump administration, Trump's statements saying, he would think this would be a wonderful thing, but he wants to increase our nuclear arsenal, which would be in violation of another treaty. So we're at least rhetorically we're heading in the wrong direction. Would it ever be possible to ban completely? I don't think so. It's not rocket science. It is easy for marginal regimes to develop these weapons, and they need them for regime survival. I think that will keep them around for a long time. You look for other parallels after the First World War. The world community pretty much banned the horrendous weapon of mass destruction of that era, chemical weapons. But now they're coming back into vogue, and they're being used as we speak, and there's barely any outcry about this. So, yeah, I'm a bit pessimistic about global zero.
We'll have to end it there, but I want to thank our speakers tonight for, yes. And we'd love to continue the conversation upstairs at a beautiful reception hosted by the Pulitzer Center and the Roosevelt House. Thank you again, Kem, the Pulitzer Center, and to you, the audience, for turning out to learn more about this very important issue. Good night.